Here we've got where the corn comes from. Yikes. Ukraine, number 4, has already fallen off the market. It is never coming back. Here's soy. Brazil is falling off the market and it is never coming back. How do you run a hog operation without soy or corn? Well, the answer is you don't, or at least it's not for export. So either you can access it or you're out of business. Here we are the world's largest producer of both soy and corn. I am not concerned about your input streams. Maybe I'm a little concerned about the pricing structure. I think that's unavoidable. But if you only take one thing away from this presentation, take this. Most of your competition will not be there in 3 years. We're at that point now. Okay, let's start with the war. Yeah, everyone's like, now, here are some maps of the Central Russian space. You have to turn your head a little bit because they're from the books. That's okay, I'm not going to judge out loud. This is a population density map, and that V of light orange going from Central Europe down into Central Siberia, that is where all the Russians live. That is the only part of the Russian space where the climate is tolerable. So in the winter, you're talking northern Minnesota in terms of temperature with the aridity of western Kansas, and that's as good as it gets in Russia. That's where you live. Whoa. The light orange is roughly a population density of the eastern half of Nebraska if you melon scoop out Lincoln and Omaha. So you have neighbors, you know their names, you don't see them every week, okay? That's where everyone lives. Now, if you go over to this map, same area, that's, the orange here is overlaid by the green here. This is an economic and climate map. And that green is the Russian wheat belt. That is home to roughly 95% of their agricultural production because it's the only place that the land doesn't completely suck. If you move to the right, to the blue, you get tundra and taiga, I think northern Canada, with worse food. If you go to the left, you go to the yellow, you're in desert. Think Phoenix without retirees. Okay? When Russians look at this, they get really depressed. Not because of the bad food or the bad weather, but because of the beige. Because the beige is flat, it's open, but it's dry, and it's either too hot or too cold. You can't really live there. You can't grow anything. There's no population. But if you have a Mongol horde or a panzer division, you can just roll right through that territory and go right into the green. And so the Russians have been invaded 50-odd times in their history because they can't defend it. Their population density is low. They can't do a mobile defense because they can't afford it. They can't even build the roads. Russia still doesn't have a road network. They've got a rail network. Now, the Russian goal since the time of Catherine the Great has been to expand beyond the green and through the beige until they get to these red arcs. These are the zones where you cannot run a Mongol horde. There's mountains, or they're too deserty, or there's water. And then they want to forward position static troops, because they don't have mobile troops, static troops, in the gateway access points between those barriers. There's 9 of them. Under the Soviet period, the Russians controlled all 9 for the first time in their history, most secure they've ever been. Soviet Union collapsed in '92. They went from 9 to 1. And everything that the Russians have done under Putin since has been about getting boots on the ground in the other 8. This is the Georgia War. This is the Kazakh intervention. This is the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is the Crimea war a few years ago. Ukraine isn't the end, it's the mid-step. And even worse, it's not that the Russians aren't going to stop until they have all of Ukraine, because Ukraine is not in one of these gateways. It's on the way to 2 of them, though. So it's not that the Russians are not going to stop until they have all of Ukraine, it's that the Russians will not stop when they have all of Ukraine. This war was always going to happen. Without it, the Russians die. We all know a Texan, right? And they just won't shut up at how big their state is. Texas is not as big as they think. Russia has borders 3 times the size of ours. They're trying to defend them with half the population and without a road network. This is the only way to make it work. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on right now. The deep red are the zones that the Russians controlled on February 22nd when the war began. The pink are the areas that they have grabbed since. There's 4 big things going on. First of all, that initial assault that we saw from Belarus down to Kiev. I need to snag my water here. Thank you. You drink it, did you? This is safe. All right. You guys remember that giant convoy, 40 miles long? APCs, tanks, military vehicles? Remember how it stalled on day 3 of the war because they forgot fuel trucks? Most people missed that on day 7 of the war, most of the soldiers had to dismount from their equipment and walk back to Belarus because they also forgot food supplies. Now, my buddies at the Defense Department were like really excited when this happened. Like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. If we ever fight them directly, we're just gonna wipe the floor with them. And then they all had a nap and some bourbon and really thought some deep thoughts about it. Like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. If we ever face them directly, we're gonna wipe the floor with them. And they see this as an existential conflict for their very survival, which means nukes come into play almost immediately. We can't let that happen. Sure, Star Wars has come a long way in the last 30 years. It's not that good. The Russians have over 1,000 nukes. We can't allow that direct fight to happen. And since we know they won't stop when they have all of Ukraine, that they're coming for countries to the west, all of which are in NATO, and so we are treaty bound to defend them, we have to make sure that that never happens. We have to kill the Russian military here and now so that it can never act again. And that means every weapon system that we possess, that we can train the Ukrainians on in a short period of time, they can have. So no jets, no F-35s, no battleships, no advanced systems, because that would just take too long. Anything else is game. There's a problem though. Those systems exist in limited volume because we, for the most part, don't use them ourselves. We don't use Stingers because we have a freaking Air Force. Use Stingers when you don't have an Air Force. We don't use Javelins because we have tank divisions. At current rates, we're gonna run out of stuff to give them within the year. We don't even make Stingers anymore. The last government order for that was 11 years ago. We're rebuilding the supply chains as quickly as we can. But just replacing the Javelins that we've already given them would take 3.5 years. There's a time issue. Okay, now obviously that assault failed. The second big push started from the occupied territories and converged on the city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. Now obviously this is important from the point of view that it's a land bridge, but most people don't understand just how critical that is for the Russians. The Russians don't fight via truck. They're not a mobile warfare military. They fight by train. And that makes this the most strategic asset in the conflict to date. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge. They built it after the Crimea War back in 2014, I think, yeah, 14. It's a rail bridge that connects Crimea directly to mainland Russia. Uh-oh. I think we've run out of, oh, there we go. I'll just move over there if I have to. The Russians fight by train, and this is the supply point for the 2 million Russians who live in occupied Crimea. Crimea is not Missouri. It imports all of its food. It's arid.